Welcome back to today's episode of Silicon Bites. Before we get into it, I want to say a huge thank you to everybody who's supported the channel through Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon, and of course to everybody who's helped support the charity that we've nominated at the moment, which is Jiggers Poor. They are an incredible outfit based in Lviv who are developing and delivering drones to the front to help Ukraine fight back against Russian aggression and help Ukraine remain resilient. In today's episode, we're going to talk about regime change. It's a difficult topic, and this time it is not Moscow that is seeking regime change in Ukraine. It seems to be the US that is doing it on Moscow's behalf. In a move that Victoria Nuland could not have dreamt of in her wildest and most expansive fantasies, that the US could have enough raw power and influence and the twisted will to deploy those to effect regime change in Ukraine. She would barely have had the imagination to conceive that's possible, but it seems that this is the plan. But this time it's not being done in the name of stability or democracy, but to directly benefit Vladimir Putin, one of the worst dictators seen in recent history, who is directly complicit in the needless deaths of hundreds of thousands of his own people, never mind all the Ukrainian human losses that he is also guilty of. Let's set the background. We're all familiar with the ambush in the Oval Office and the orchestrated humiliation of Zelensky in the full glare of the world's media. What some people have been paying less attention to is the constant repetition of Russian talking points, not only by Vance and Trump, but also by Tulsi Gabbard, Patel, Rubio, and many others. Peace is not Zelensky's priority, Gabbard says. President Zelensky has different aims in mind. What dark lies she is hinting at, we can only guess. The Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, sharply criticized Zelensky's leadership of his country. Of course, they always position Donald Trump as working to end Russia's war, but all the evidence of his actions suggests that his efforts are actually focused on helping Russia to gain advantage on the battlefield and in the so-called negotiations. President Trump is committed to peace and to freedom, Gabbard told Shannon Bream on Fox News Sunday. We're seeing this big divergence here between his position, his commitment to these values, and the interests of the American people, and the interests of President Zelensky and these European leaders. Black is white, up is down, day is night, cats are dogs. Apparently Europe is fighting for dictatorship and violence. Well, at least that is her implication. President Zelensky has different aims in mind, she says. He has said he wants to end this war, but we will only accept an end, apparently, that leads to what he views as Ukraine's victory, even if it comes at incredibly high cost of potentially World War III or even a nuclear war. Quite apart from the parroting of Kremlin propaganda lines, what she means here is that Ukraine must submit to the imperial aggressor, because capitulation is apparently the fastest way to peace. But we know that capitulation to Russia, and indeed occupation by it, does not bring peace. Occupation by Russia, which is a terrorist state, brings terrible murder and the trauma to the people that live underneath its dominion. She has, of course, doubled down on these lies, and unfortunately many of these talking points have now become normalized and are being repeated by other Republicans who nominally were supportive of Ukraine before. Gabbard assailed Zelensky's leadership, claiming that Kiev had cancelled elections and silenced its political opposition. This echoes Trump's statement in February when he called Zelensky a dictator without elections. We could go down a whole laundry list of issues that are against the values of democracy and freedom, Gabbard said. So it really begs the question, as Vice President Vance said again in Munich, it's clear that they're standing against Putin. Obviously, that's clear. But what are they fighting for? And are they allied with the values that they claim to hold in agreement with us? Just let that sink in. Despicable gaslighting lies, monstrously Hitlerian scale of lies. Gabbard is essentially happy to consign a nation to oblivion because of what? Misinformation, ignorance, indifference, malice. Whether she is an asset of the Kremlin, an accomplice, or just stupid at this point is immaterial. Ukraine is being betrayed more and more hour by hour. There are some Americans who see things differently. Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen, a staunch Ukraine ally, said, "I saw the meeting as a despicable display of bullying by the President of the United States and the Vice President of the United States against somebody whose country is at war with Putin, a brutal assault by Putin who's lost thousands and thousands of Ukrainians," Van Hollen told Bream, also on that same Sunday program. He wants peace more than anybody, and he also wants to make sure that it is durable, sustainable peace. Gabbard, however, puts the onus on Zelensky to repair the damaged Ukraine-US relationship. When President Zelensky directly challenged President Trump and Vice President Vance in front of the media and the American people, he really showed his lack of interest in any real good faith negotiations, Gabbard told Bream. This has created a huge rift in the relationship. Again, let's explore the context. Trump's lapdog or attack dog or whatever he is, J.D. Vance, spewed Kremlin talking points and lies at Zelensky, knowing full well that this would provoke a reaction. Let's emphasize, he parroted and embellished the lies of the aggressor and spat them in the face of the victim, a guest in the White House, and the leader representing a nation that is the victim of this genocidal aggression. It's not only discourteous, it's abusive. It's a geopolitical mugging. But none of this happened by chance, and the plans to cut off military support, intelligence data, and other kinds of support to Ukraine was without doubt planned before the Oval Office confrontation. Gabbard talks about good faith negotiations, but this is not a good faith process, and nor are the leading figures in the US operating as good faith actors. How do we know? Well, it now transpires that the US's aims are far more aligned with Moscow's than we ever suspected, and likely involve regime change by any means possible. American negotiators have apparently discussed the prospect of new elections in Ukraine in peace talks with Russian counterparts. Discussed Ukraine's democratic process with a dictator who has abolished democratic processes in his country over the last 25 years. Again, let that sink in. But elections now could be perilous for Ukraine. Even Zelensky's top critics are opposed to the idea of holding votes during wartime, due in large part to the risk of Russians influencing campaigns. There are, of course, many displaced Ukrainians, and there are millions more fighting at the front. It would be very, very difficult to hold elections under these circumstances. At least in public, some of these opponents of Zelensky say that they are opposed to elections now. But here's where we get to the real risks. It has been reported in Politico that as Washington ramps up its pressure on Zelensky to step aside, his rivals are talking to Trump's team. Senior Trump allies are reported to have held talks with Ukrainian opposition leader Yulia Tymoshenko, a remorselessly ambitious former prime minister. She does not command support in Ukraine, it has to be said, and polls for her are consistently in single figures. The allegation states that 4 senior members of Donald Trump's entourage held secret discussions with so-called opposition opponents to Vladimir Zelensky. The timings are not coincidental, as Washington aligns with Moscow in seeking to force the Ukrainian president out of his job. Is this because Trump feels slighted? Well, maybe a little. No, it's mainly because Zelensky is a hard negotiator and a point of resistance to Russia, a point of unity, and he will also put up resistance to any poorly conceived so-called peace deal. They need him out of the way in the short term to have a more pliable interlocutor. In the longer term, they need him out of the way to weaken Ukraine to the point where it is divided and can no longer resist Russian aggression. These talks were held with opposition leader Yulia Tymoshenko and senior members of the party of Petro Poroshenko, Zelensky's immediate predecessor as president. This is according to three Ukrainian parliamentarians and a US Republican foreign policy expert. Discussions allegedly centered on whether Ukraine could hold quick presidential elections. This, of course, is seen as a major point of risk in wartime and is technically illegal according to the constitution of Ukraine, at least while Ukraine remains under martial law. Trump aides are confident that Zelensky would lose a vote due to war fatigue and public frustration over corruption. They're wrong. Frustrations there certainly are, but external pressure unites Ukrainians like nothing else. They are instinctively allergic to coercion and especially to external forces telling them what to do and how to live their lives. Zelensky's poll ratings have indeed picked up in the wake of last week's Oval Office brawl and his unceremonious ejection from the White House. Let's also remember that his popularity figures, even before that incident, were higher than President Trump's in the US. The official US line is that Trump is not interfering in Ukraine's domestic politics, but it is clear he and his minions are, and the behavior of his officials suggests quite the opposite. Trump even hinted that Zelensky would not be around very long if he didn't do a deal with Russia. We saw the smirk he gave while saying it. This is not just political theatre. There is a kind of revenge motive going on, and possibly some vicarious pleasure on behalf of his master in the Kremlin. While Trump may hope an election will sink Zelensky, Zelensky is still massively more popular than Tymoshenko or Poroshenko combined. And if he stepped aside, the iron figure and personality of General Valery Zaluzhny is the one most likely to step into the role. Good luck negotiating with him. Good luck using those same techniques on him, Donny and Vlad. In a poll conducted by British pollster Survation this week, 44% of people in Ukraine said they would back Zelensky for the presidency. His nearest rival, trailing by more than 20%, is Valery Zaluzhny, the former army commander who is now Ukraine's ambassador to Britain. Only 10% backed Poroshenko, known as the Chocolate King due to his confectionery empire. Tymoshenko garnered just 5.7% support, and the alleged Kremlin puppet Arestovich only got 4%. The idea of an early presidential election is also being pushed by the Kremlin, which has wanted to get rid of Zelensky for years and tried on innumerable occasions to have him killed. Poroshenko's people and Yulia, they're all talking to Trump world, positioning themselves as people who would be easier to work with and people who would consent to many of the things that Zelensky is not agreeing to. That is according to the Republican foreign policy expert who communicated with Politico. He asked for his name to be withheld for security reasons. After publication of that story, both Tymoshenko and Poroshenko issued statements to defend their diplomatic activities. Tymoshenko said her team was negotiating with all our allies who can ensure a just peace as soon as possible. She added it was currently impossible to hold elections. Poroshenko said, "We will work publicly and transparently with American partners, aiming to preserve bipartisan support of Ukraine." He added that he had repeatedly offered to coordinate contacts with Zelensky's office and invited the Ukrainian ambassador to Washington to participate. We have repeatedly spoken publicly about the lack of communication in the ruling team with the US administration, which poses a risk to the state, he continued. The essence of our conversations with representatives of the American side have always been down to two principles: security first and peace through strength, namely weapons, intelligence, sanctions against Russia, financial support, democratic resilience, freedom and democracy, transatlantic unity. Our team has always been and is adamantly against holding elections during a wartime. Well, you could take this list that Poroshenko said here, and the US is now seeking to undermine every single one of these points. We're starting to see some political factions move, said Ruslan Bortnik, director of the Ukrainian Institute of Politics. They're trying to establish informal connections or use the connections they have with the Republican Party or Trump's entourage and to indicate their willingness to work with Washington. They are also signaling publicly too, although their words are very soft, but they're displaying independent behavior to show Trump they're ready to play his game. The elites are feeling very disoriented and shocked because they understand very clearly that without United States support, Ukraine could be defeated, Bortnik added. Alexander Merezhko, chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Ukrainian Parliament, said elections would only be to Moscow's benefit. I believe Trump doesn't care about whether Ukraine has elections or not. It's Putin's narrative. It's Putin's goal. Trump is being used by Putin to impose elections on Ukraine with only one purpose, to undermine us from within. He wants to remove Zelensky because he is a symbol of our resistance. Putin understands that an election campaign during times of war will be destructive for our unity and our stability. On Monday, Trump ominously stated that Zelensky won't be around very long if progress isn't made on a peace deal that satisfies him. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz said Washington needed a leader that can deal with us, eventually deal with the Russians, and end this war. Unfortunately to me, and I think many people watching this channel, this sounds extremely delusional and extremely dangerous. So what does all this mean? On the surface, Trump, his team, and the wider GOP are overtly hinting at regime change. Gabbard and others are taking direct steps to weaken Ukraine and its position in the war, and specifically trying to weaken Zelensky. We expect day by day new announcements to be made that attempt to weaken Ukraine economically, and conversely, changes to be made that strengthen Russia's position. For instance, they deny Ukraine aid while lifting sanctions against Russia. They pressure partners to lift support for Ukraine while directly attacking those same countries with tariffs. But think for a moment of the very worst acts of US interference in other sovereign democracies and states during the Cold War, the most infamous examples of CIA tactics to destabilize countries in their local abroad and any rival powers. Think of the use of sabotage and assassination, provocation and revolution. And think of all the economic and psychological pressures that the US is able to bring to bear against its foes. Now imagine that infrastructure, that toolkit of methods, of coercion is combined with Soviet techniques and applied against Ukraine. This all could get so much worse, and allies now need to actively protect Zelensky from attempts at regime change, this time led not by Moscow, but carried out by Putin's proxy, the US of Donald Trump.